Their exposure therapy, despite how it sounds, and it's funny. I had a patient this morning, a young man, say to me, I said, "Do you know what that means?" Because it's kind of a scary word. And he said, "Do you mean making decisions that are the opposite of what my OCD wants me to do?" And I said, "Wow, yeah, maybe I'll just start saying that to people now instead of exposure therapy." Um, so the experience of exposure is very, very simple, but it's also very, very nuanced. And so we look at the principles of learning theory, and that's where exposure therapy came from. And so very, very quickly, we think of anxiety disorders that are often developed through classical conditioning or associative learning. And so everybody, if you've taken a Psych 101 class, Pavlov and the dog, that a unconditioned stimulus becomes paired with a neutral stimulus to become the conditioned stimulus. And so once you have a connection between two things, so for example, if I have a panic attack in an elevator, those two things become paired. So whenever I walk up to an elevator, my body goes into a panic state. It's just associative learning. How I respond to that fear is operant conditioning. And so it's based on the consequences of that behavior. So when I walk up to the elevator and feel the fear, and I make a decision to avoid by taking the stairs, I feel less anxious. And that is rewarded because less anxiety is good. And so through operant conditioning, all these decisions about making decisions based on fear versus preference are really, really rewarded, and they actually become reinforced over time. So with that knowledge, exposure therapy we know it's effective because anxiety is a physiological experience. So we know that one's sympathetic nervous system becomes activated, which is your fight or flight response, in order to protect you. Our bodies are very, very efficient. Once we let our body know that we're not actually in danger, we're not running from a bear, we're not tackling a mugger, and we're not running from a burning building, the body wants to turn off that system because it takes a fair amount of work to get all that going. And so once exposure therapy is hinged on this idea that when we present you with something that is the perception of threat, not actually scary, the perception of threat, and we hang out there long enough, we do that long enough till the brain realizes, oh, there's no danger, turn on the parasympathetic nervous system and shut that down. And that process is known as habituation. And so habituation is this experience where you jumped into a pool and it's freezing, and you get out immediately and you try to get back in and you get out because it's cold. Every single experience is terrible. We know, everybody knows, and the advice everybody would give you is get into the pool and stay in the pool. Your body will get used to it. And that's the process of habituation. You put your shirt on today, you can feel the weight of the shirt on your shoulders. After a few seconds of wearing it, we forget that we're wearing a shirt. And so we know systematically that when we expose individuals to the things that that feel very scary, they're not dangerous, they feel very scary, and they don't run away, avoid, or engage in some safety behavior or something to minimize or mitigate the anxiety, that their anxiety will reduce. And that has to happen just a few times for their brain now to learn that, oh, this experience does not actually require the sympathetic nervous system. So that is exposure therapy in a very quick and down and dirty explanation, I guess. But you can imagine now how when you present yourself with something that's anxiety provoking and you avoid it, your body turns on the parasympathetic nervous system, but the message is still, yeah, that thing was bad. There's no learning that it wasn't. So there's a million things we can do to help to expose people to the things that are scary, mostly because a lot of the fear is cognitive. It's a lot of, it's a lot of appraisals of situations and anticipatory events and things like that. We're not talking just about dogs and spiders and needles and things like that. We're talking about events that have not happened yet. And so it's a paradox because we're asking people to do the thing that they genuinely are afraid of. And the response is amazing. People get better.
Yeah, that is pretty impressive. And it's interesting just to note it's another great example of this, I suppose, inability for us to probably pull apart the psychological and physiological responses in many ways, and that we're impacting both through a therapy like this, presumably.
Yeah, and it's not that, people need exposure not because they're not tough or mentally tough or anything like that. They're just doing what their body is telling them to do. And so when you feel distress, uh, we're hedonists. Your body is saying, do not do that. Exposure is so difficult, and I'm, always in awe at the courage that my patients have, because fundamentally, when every single thing in their body is telling them to run away, they're signing up for therapy and paying money to sit there and endure it. And of course, that's because it's impairing their life in some way. Now, initially, you said, or can it not be done correctly? The question that many people write to me are things like, I'm terrified of public speaking. I have a panic attack when I do that, for example. And yet I public speak every week. But that fear hasn't gone away. If exposure therapy would work, why wouldn't that work? Or I'm afraid of driving, but I have to drive to work. Um, I do it every day. I've done it for the last 10 years. If exposure therapy worked, why does that work? And so on. You get the point. The problem is in order for exposure therapy to be effective, one has to be vulnerable to the experience of anxiety. What these folks are likely doing is they're white knuckling the experience. And so they're keeping the learning as, this thing's bad, I just need it over, I just need it over. So they're holding on to the steering wheel as tight as they can. And when they get to work, the message is, you didn't die this time. And not anything can happen and you'll be okay because you can tolerate bad things happening. The message is, what a fluke, you made it this time. And so the fear persists. So if you engage in any safety behaviors, and the safety behavior is any behavior you do to mitigate anxiety. So if you have to speak publicly, and again, you're managing uncertainty. So you want to know how many people are there. Will there be a podium? And some people say, well, I feel safer if there's a podium. Is there a microphone? Can I have my notes? Can I have a glass of water? Can I have a mint? Can you shine lights on me so I can't really see people out there? These are all safety behaviors that if you employ these and the presentation is successful, people even say, hey, great job. What you come up with, the conclusion is, that was just a really nice crowd. The next crowd won't understand, or that was just a fluke for me, or man, but what if next time they don't have bottled water, or whatever it is. We come up with a reason to minimize our attempts at trying to get better. So it's not about white knuckling it and getting through something terrible. It's not fear factor, where you're closing your eyes and squinting. That's what we do just to get over something that we'll never really have to do again. And that's fine. But that's not exposure.
Just while we talk about either exposure therapy or maybe anything else that might be used in practice, when it comes to using these to deal with anxiety, is it a case that these practices actually can lead to this elimination of anxiety or the anxiety disorder, or is it simply a case of trying to increase that ability to deal with it, or that increase that tolerance that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the answer is it depends, and everybody's different. But the truth is, it's a total paradox. What I tell people is, you're not in therapy to get rid of your anxiety. You're here to change your relationship with it. With that said, once that becomes the expectation, and you start spending times of your day going looking for your fear, it starts to be nowhere to be found. And over time, people no longer meet criteria for the diagnosis, because once it's not impairing anymore, you don't have that disorder anymore. And so now you're just functioning like everyone else. So if you're going out looking for opportunities to trigger your social anxiety to prove to yourself you can tolerate that, I don't know if you have social anxiety anymore. Now, do you get nervous when things are embarrassing? Yes, absolutely. But that fear of being embarrassed, like the rest of us, does that prevent you from going to a social event that somebody asked you to? Not anymore. So I don't know if you have social anxiety anymore. Panic's the same thing. So if you are, now exercising again, a lot of people stop exercising when they get panic attacks because they don't want to change their physiology at all. They don't want their heart to beat fast. They don't want to sweat. They don't want to get hot. So if you can drink 3 Red Bulls and run around the block and do everything you can to trigger a panic attack and it doesn't come, you stop being afraid of that. Then by paradox, it stops coming and you get better and you don't have it anymore.